Thank you again for joining us today. My name is Phil Gwoke. I will be your host for this community conversation. We have been having these discussions just about every month since last fall, given all the events of 2020. And as many of you are aware, our business at BridgeWorks is to study people and how the events of history affect people. And most certainly, we are at a time in history that we haven't seen in 4 generations. And so because of that, we have invited some amazing guests to join us, experts in their field, educators, thought leaders, professionals from various backgrounds to partner with us to give anyone who's interested insights, ourselves included, on how we can best navigate these times. And today, as we go through this conversation, you are here and you submitted several questions, and we are going to do our best to get to as many questions as we possibly can. At the same time, if questions arise throughout today's conversation, we have a chat feature that is available to you. Please submit additional questions. We are going to take some time at the end of our conversation to get to those. And that essentially is the guidelines for today. So let me get to the exciting part. I am so honored to introduce to you today our guest, Lani Phillips, who happens to be the Vice President of Channel Sales at Microsoft. For those of you that had the opportunity to join us last time, we had a friend and colleague of Lani with us, Miss Karen Fascio, in our previous discussion, also from Microsoft. And the thing that so impressed me the first time that I spoke with you, Lani, is your commitment to authenticity. And so our focus today is going to be about effective leadership in these very modern and changing times that we are in. But before we do that, I want to just highlight a few of your just significant accomplishments, if you will. So you were most recently recognized with the 2020 Global Mind Education Inclusive Leader Award, and as one of the top 10 most influential women in cloud insights in Insights Success magazine. You were also awarded the 2020 Executive Impact Award from Linkage and the CRN 2020 Women in Channel, Leading Fearlessly in Times of Crisis, featuring the top women in channel. And you founded the Women Executive Channel Advisory Board, comprised of all female executives who are focused on creating more opportunities for women in channel. So you have done a lot of amazing things. So welcome and thank you for being here with us today. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling so good, Phil. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you. Every time I hear those accomplishments, I just say, wow, who are we talking about? But I'm humbled to be sitting here with you and having the conversation that we're about to have.
Thank you so much for being here. So the core goal of today is to just speak to the questions that people that are here with us have that are top of mind to them. But before we do that, amidst all your accomplishments, you're a person. You have a story. And I'd like it if maybe you just gave a few highlights of what are the ingredients that makes Lani Lani, and what has shaped who you are as the person, the leader, the human being, thought leader. What's made you you?
You know, it would be difficult for me to tell my story without telling you from where I come and what I learned from it. And where I came from is I think about my mother. And most recently, I've been a little bit more vocal about my mother because my mother was an amazing school teacher who, when it came down to people, she just genuinely loved people. And she was all about what she could do to be of service to people. And the thing that I remembered, and it helped shape who I am today, is I unfortunately lost my mother at 12 years of age. She had cancer, she lost her fight with cancer, and it was at her funeral. She had 2 funerals, and there were so many people that were there to celebrate her life at both funerals. But the thing that I remembered is all the things they said about my mother. And they spoke about how she just loved them, supported them, encouraged them, challenged them. And I remember as a 12-year-old girl being annoyed by being forced to sit at a funeral, and two of them on
Mm,
top of that, because that's my mom. But I look
mm,
back on it today and it shaped who I am. And so
mm,
as I'm going through life, I just recognize that we all have big dreams and big goals. But at the end of the day, when you take your last breath, what do you want people to say about you? And I've just
mm.
chosen to live my life the way my mother lived her life, and that's making a difference in the world. So that's the reason why I am the way I am. I just hold myself to a high bar in terms of making a difference.
Wow. Thank you so much. Sorry for your loss at an early age,
Uh,
but as we all know, those experiences have shaped us and made us the people that we are today. And so grateful that you are here with us today.
Thank you.
Uh, let's, we've got a handful of questions that are around the topic of authenticity and being your authentic self. And that's why I wanted to start with just a little recap of what's made you you. I think you show up so transparent and so honest. And it's difficult for people to do that sometimes, especially I think in today's world when we're very concerned about, what we might say and who we might offend. And this first question goes to the point of creating an environment, right? The question is, what advice do you have for setting expectations with your team around growth mindset and fostering an environment that feels honest and safe? And I think leaders need to know how to do that. What would you suggest?
Well, it's a couple of elements that you have to think about when you create that type of environment. But you first have to look at yourself as a leader first and remember that in order to foster an environment like that, you have to have a level of vulnerability. You also have to have the courage to do it as well. And then you've got to make sure that you're walking the talk. So there's a
Hmm.
couple of things that I do to try to create that environment where people feel safe and they feel like they can practice the growth mindset. And the one thing that I always try to strive is we've got to let go of perfection and feeling like we always have to show up perfect. And we've got to be willing to admit that we get it wrong sometimes and really try to create a culture where you're focusing on the learnings instead of everything being so perfect. I also
Hmm.
think it's important that you figure out what are some of those new behaviors you want to create in your environment. You got to operationalize those behaviors. Like, for example, if you're going to value learning, then you need to create those moments where you actually reflect on events that have happened, projects that you've worked on, and be able to reflect on what did we learn from this? When we don't meet a goal, what did we learn from this? Even when you have met a goal, what did we learn from this? Because there are always things that we can say we want to continue doing, and there's always those things that you can continue to do better. And then you need to make sure that you recognize it in others. When other people see you celebrating others on your team for taking risks, investing in the learning, and you're calling them out and say, hey, I want to thank John or Sally for investing that extra time and really trying to understand what we've learned in this situation. Instead of focusing on the success, let's have a conversation where we're talking about the learnings and just make sure you celebrate the behaviors that you want to see. I think all of that together are some of the ingredients.
Those are some really great points. If you're joining us, make sure you have your pens, your papers, you're taking good notes. These are pro tips. And as Lani was speaking, it reminded me of some of the research I've done around creating environments of psychological safety where people feel comfortable. And your point about creating a space where the focus is on the learning, what we're, how we're, what we're getting, not just going through it, but growing through it and getting
Growing from
from
it.
it, is
Mhm.
such a great reminder and space to create. So awesome advice on how to set that tone. Now I've got a couple of questions about showing up as your authentic self when maybe the current leadership doesn't like that. They're not creating that space for you. And I'm going to read this question word for word, because I think it's really important. In a male-dominated construction industry, toughness, skills, and determination are highly valued. Empathy and kindness are typically viewed as more feminine qualities and rarely, if ever, encouraged as a point of potential professional growth. How can we communicate the importance of kindness, open and honest communication, empathy to both management and workers in a way to get them to buy in and not feel as though we're threatening their masculinity? And I'm just going to add one more question to that, and that is, how do you be your authentic self, especially as an African American? So I want you to speak to showing up authentically as a woman in a male-dominated society and as an African American woman, which are two really important dynamics that, in the spirit of inclusivity and intersectionality, we really need some insights and understanding about.
So thanks for that question. I'll address the one that's in the male-dominated, where you don't want to rob someone of their masculinity. And I have just learned two things as I've been on my journey of really bringing my authentic self to work every single day. One, I can't change anyone. And I recognize that the best thing I can do is just, I have to just let go of other people's expectations of me. And I've just learned to stand in my truth. And I'm always going to try to be respectful, but I stopped trying to fit in, because that's where I got into trouble. And I also had to recognize that I am different, I am unique, and that's okay. And if others aren't willing to embrace it, again, I have to let that go, because I can't hold on to that, because what I'll end up doing is changing myself. And in regards to how to change your leadership team and how others think, I just think the best thing you can do is just show up that way, be the example, let them see it, and really try hard not to point out failures in others. Just try to practice good behaviors and just continue to work on how you show up in the world. Let me give you some steps. I actually did a talk on this at the Microsoft Include conference a week ago, and it was really focused on everything that BridgeWorks is about. And the first step was self-awareness. Before you can do anything around being authentic, you need to know who you are. You need to know what you value, those things that are important to you. You need to kind of know your strengths. You need to know your weaknesses. You need to know kind of who you are and what you're about, because I always tell people, how you expect other people to get to know you and you don't even know you? All right, so it's around self-awareness. The other one is practicing vulnerability, and some people refer to it as covering. So one of the first things that I had to learn to do is I had to learn to be okay with those parts of me that were not perfect or according to the norm like everyone else. Like, one of the things that I don't talk about often, because I usually keep my family kind of off limits, but I'm very proud of my son that's 11 years old, but he has special needs. And being very open and being willing to admit that. I've always been very private about his special needs, because I felt like what his special needs were, whenever people talked about their kids, he wasn't at the same milestones as everyone else. And what I've learned when I practiced vulnerability and I was willing to talk about his special needs, that I connected with people more, because there was always somebody who had a challenge or something that could relate to the experience I was having. And I found people were willing to share more. I also learned the importance of leveraging your superpowers. We all have something unique and special inside us that really makes us special, and it allows us to differentiate who we are. Figure out what those are and practice using them. And then what you will find, if they're really superpowers, other people will begin to recognize it and really begin to embrace it. The other step I shared was lead from your core. And that was actually a friend of mine who came up with an acronym. Her name is Dr. Angela Anderson. And she used to say, it's so important to claim your voice, own your voice, recognize your voice, and evolve your voice. the power in all of that is finding your voice and using it, and recognizing that over time, if it's your tone or your message needs to be tweaked, you're going to get the feedback so that you can adjust it over time. But I have just learned the power in just really sharing my perspective and really having a point of view about something and making sure the last step was to get feedback. I'm a feedback junkie. I want people to tell me, is it working, not working? And that's the only way that you evolve it. But as an authentic leader, it all starts with you and just being open to, showing up as yourself and letting go of perfectionism. You have to let it go because nobody out there is perfect. I
I
hope
love
that
that.
helped.
I've got a sheet full of notes that are building up here. I want to make sure I captured that core. Claim your voice, own your voice, recognize your voice,
And
and
evolve.
the last,
Evolve.
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 Evolve. That's
Evolve your voice because over time you're going to know what works, what doesn't work, right? And
mhm.
so it'll evolve
Yeah.
over time. Your story is going to evolve. The more you talk about your story, that thing you're uncomfortable talking about, it'll get better over time. You'll get more comfortable with it and you'll own it more.
I think that's such an important concept for people to grasp right now, because change, when we're asked to change, the human psyche, for whatever reason, gets a little offended or maybe even threatened, because if I'm asked to change it, it's assuming that I must be doing something wrong. But in the spirit of authenticity and what you've described as not having to be perfect, it's okay. We can in a safe environment where it's about learning, it truly is evolving, growing, and being okay with who I am today isn't probably as smart or as effective as I'll be tomorrow. And that doesn't make yesterday bad. It just makes tomorrow really promising. So I enjoy all those ideas that you shared. I think it's really valuable. I also am reminded of a quote that says, most of us, or all of us, all of us are born originals, but we die copies. And what I've heard you say several times here is that you're being okay with who you are. And when you talked about leveraging your superpower, finding your superpower, not copying somebody else's. So brilliant thoughts in there. Very
You know what I
valuable.
thought about? You know what I thought about when I was preparing for this talk? And that literally were the points I landed in the talk. Um, I thought about those of us who have had, so some of us probably have some form of a designer that you really love. And then
Mm,
you saw and also a copy of this
yeah.
design that you really love, right? For me, being female, I love a designer bag. I'm a purse girl, right? So
Okay.
let's just say one of my favorite designers is Louis Vuitton. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
So you go into a designer store, you know what it feels like to go into a designer store, you know the attention you get. And when you touch something that is a designer original, you know the smell, the taste, you look
Mm,
at it, it's just plush, thick, quality, right? And then you see something that is a copy
mm,
the designer
mm.
original, it comes up a little short, doesn't it? They're using cheap materials. You
Yes.
go to try to zip it, it may fall off the track. The leather
Right.
is not as thick, it's super thin. And you hope that, it could pass. To me, I just feel like we all need to recognize that we're all designer originals. Let's stop trying to be copies of the designer because you're already a designer original. So let's
Right.
just figure out the
Exactly.
best version of yourself and bring it forward. And we're all imperfect, and that's okay.
Hmm.
I just think
So
we have to
true.
let go of that. Yeah, it's so
So
important.
true. Um, we're getting some nice compliments in the chat. I'm just keeping an eye on that. And also a point was made that in a male-dominated field, it's also important to ask the input of and value their knowledge, right? So it is definitely a give and take. And if we, in the spirit of inclusivity, show up as our authentic selves, it takes a certain amount of bravery and courage to allow other people to show up as their authentic selves. So such valuable stuff. I want to move to another topic that we probably had more questions on this than anything submitted, and that is, do you have any advice on how to create an environment that is psychologically safe, demonstrates empathy, um, can motivate people in this virtual setting that we find ourselves in right now? How do you create those kind of connections when we can't, via technology?
It's tough, isn't it? I think more now than ever, I think for those of you that are trying to establish that connection without being able to see the individual, it's just tough. So wherever you can, turn on your cameras and
Mm,
insist that your employees turn on your cameras. And here's one of the first things that I've tried to do to create that psychologically safe environment and demonstrate empathy. And you just let them know, you know what? No judgment zone. I don't care
mm,
what you look like. I don't care if you combed your hair. All I want to do is see your face. I just want to
mm,
see your face so I can connect with you. No
right.
judgments. And when you say that, it demonstrates a level of empathy and understanding that we're all doing the best we can right now. And we're barely pulling it together to sit in front of a
Mm,
computer to do our job. And just give them permission to not be perfect and saying no judgment zone. I think the other thing that you need to do as a leader is we have to remember that we are in a human capital business and we got to pause. And we can't just jump in and have a formal conversation. We need to have a check in before you
mm,
start any conversation, is just ask how they're doing. There's so many strategies for doing that. So one-on-one, I have a strategy, and then I have the one to few, and then one to a large group. So I'll share all three. One-on-one, just say, I'm just checking on you, the person, the individual. How are you really doing? And when
mm,
they're talking, just genuinely listen. And then if you hear them expressing concern, then just unpack it and then begin to ask questions like, what does support look like for you?
mm,
And allow them to tell you what support they need. And then I would encourage you to make sure that you follow through on that. If you see they're really struggling, sometimes be willing to abandon your agenda to create space to just listen and allow them to share and be there to support them. And I've had to do that in so many scenarios one on one during this time. One to few, you can start the conversation with, hey, I'd love to do a 2-word check in. Pick 2 words to describe how you're feeling today and allow each person to share it. Or, like, I have a weekly meeting with my LT. I usually just pick a random question. What's one hobby you've picked up during COVID? What was your favorite thing
mm,
you did over the weekend? Just pick an icebreaker as a question and allow them to share. And then in the one to larger groups, you can ask, just take 2 words to describe how you're feeling and tell them to put it in the chat.
mm, mm-hmm.
And
That's
just
great.
pausing and recognizing how people are feeling out there and recognizing if the energy is down, go ahead and give a voice to that. But I think in terms of creating that empathy and that psychologically safe environment, it all starts with you checking in on them and giving them permission to not be okay. And then it
Mm,
also means you have to be authentic about where you're at and acknowledge you've had some tough days. People want to know, right? And be willing to demonstrate your own vulnerability. And the other thing I would say is create and build in virtual activities that's not about work, but it's really about connection. I have a wonderful executive assistant that is so creative. Ashley came up with this idea of us to do this paint and sip, but instead of painting an image, and a lot of people are doing that with the paint by number, we actually
mm-hmm.
created like wood boards with our family names on it, People created
Mm.
signs for their office, and they sent all the materials to each individual. And all we did was set time aside for us to work on these projects. And we were all
Mm.
virtual, working from our rooms. Somebody was baking cake, and we were just sharing with one another. And we were just working away, talking about life and what we had wished we had done more of. Some of us was trying to leverage our workout equipment and was struggling. It was just the bonding and the connection, and we all just came as we were. And I
Wow.
think it's all of these little things that feed your building a culture of where empathy and psychologically safe, it just all begins to become reality. But it's just these little micro steps that you have to pour into it to build this culture. Does that answer the question?
I think beyond anyone's expectation. Those were some theoretical ideas, but also some very practical things that people can do to create that. I'm just curious, maybe you have a few insights. We're both about the same stage in life, and we've been in our careers for 20 plus years. Any advice specifically for long-term employees or team members, staff who most of their career has not been an environment like this? I think we hear comments that younger folks are embracing some of this change a little easier than those who've been doing this for a long time. If your personal experience tells you otherwise, I would love, I would appreciate any pushback. But if you've had any encounters with some folks who are like, I'm not sitting at my desk painting wood boxes while we got work to do, or something to that effect. any any advice on how to motivate those folks?
Oh, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink.
Right on.
I would say whenever you're choosing activities, to make sure you give the group an opportunity to vote on those activities and go with the
Okay.
majority and have several options. So, yes, we do have individuals that resist some of the virtual activities. They resist this idea of technology. They want to get by with as little as possible. And I think as leaders, we have to remember we have to create a psychologically safe environment for them as well. And I think it's important that instead of calling them out in a group setting, that's one of those one-on-one that you just check in. Because what I have found, sometimes resistance come from, usually is it a lack of skill and they just need to learn? Or is it just something they absolutely don't want to be a part of? And I'll tell you, we make all of those events optional, by the way. But
Mhm.
sometimes whenever you see resistance, it's usually coming from somewhere. And I would
Right.
probably go to that individual and just check in to figure out what it is that is holding them back from wanting to participate.
I love that you give, the advice to let people vote, give them that option, and that's creating some flexibility in the scenario. Uh, Doubling down a little bit more on the thought of different generations. This person submitted a question, and I love it. She gives me a shout out. She says, "I'm a female." She goes, "I'm a female Gen Xer. Hi, Phil." And just so you know, Gen Xers this year are between the ages of 42 and 56. In 2021. So that's kind of the span there. But in her case, she's saying excuse me, people, men mostly often quite a bit younger than she, assume she doesn't know what she's talking about. And it turns around quickly after we start working together, but she's a little frustrated thinking that the generational challenges were behind us. But she's finding that people are still making assumptions about her as a woman, her age, and she just wonders if there's any thoughts around that. And again, in the certain industries, we talked about technology, we talk about manufacturing and construction that tend to be male dominated. Any advice for this fellow Gen Xer female as to how she can establish her credibility out of the gate, especially with some young folks who are going, we don't know that you know what you're talking about.
Well, I say she's doing something right because she always turns them around. So keep doing
Mm.
what you're doing, my friend. That's what I would say. Here,
Great
one of
advice.
the things that I realize is even with the younger generation, we all hold a lot of hope in them that they will be able to embrace this new environment where people aren't judged by how they look or where they're from, but they're actually judged for the quality of their thoughts and who they are on the inside. But I've also learned that we all hold bias. And we
Mm,
all have to make sure that we check in on those biases and they are learned. And so you
mm,
never know how people were raised and what
mm,
unconscious or conscious biases that they may have. And no matter how much we want to see it change, we've got to just make sure that we continue to challenge each other and continue to practice ourselves, really looking in the mirror to understand our biases and how it shows up in regards to when we are confronted by the whatever bias you're holding, if it's against a particular group or person, when they show up in front of you, then your energy shifts. You automatically draw conclusions that may or may not be accurate. And for her or anyone in that scenario, it's hard to confront people's personal biases because most of them are so good at trying to hide it. So that's
mm,
part of that. They're hiding behind a mask, and you're trying to understand why is it they haven't given me a fair shot yet. And that's just something over time that we're going to have to deal with. And anytime you feel like there is a bias towards you and someone's treating you poorly as a result of it, at the right time, I think you should approach the conversation delicately. Try not to do it in an adversarial way, but to let them know, hey, I had this experience with you and I want to tell you how it made me feel. This is the
mhm,
way I walked away. Instead of telling them you were wrong for this, tell them the impact it had on you. And
mm, mhm,
usually, people who are well intentioned will always react to that because they'll be like, wow, I didn't know that my actions had that level of impact on you. And they may immediately begin to apologize. So, those are some of the things that I usually recommend, but I do acknowledge that bias is out there. We all have them, none of us are excused from it. So we
right.
just have to acknowledge that those behaviors are learned. And I tell people one way to know you have a bias towards something is when something happens, or I usually pick, there's usually an individual where you have those little hairs stand up on your hand, or you get aggressive all of a sudden because of something they said is rubbing you wrong. You've got a bias, and I usually say bias equals a judgment. You
Mm,
have a judgment
mm,
about something,
mhm,
and you need to check it because they will begin to feel it, whether you're willing to admit it or not. You've left them with an experience in most cases. So I hope that helped them a little.
I think so. And um, as you were sharing, I appreciated, first of all, the admittance that we do all have bias. It comes from experiences. To deny it would be foolish. We're kidding ourselves to think that those things don't exist. But I liked that you said, you believe when someone's coming from a good place, they've got good intentions, and whether because it's true or because it just helps me with my own psyche, that's how I approach every situation. I just want to believe that this person means different, but then to ignore it doesn't allow opportunity for growth. So I really enjoy or value your suggestion of coming at this is how it made me feel.
Mhm.
Now you have two people believing that they want the best for each other, and you create opportunity for that evolution that we talked about earlier, that growth that is possible through that. Um, I also think back to something you said earlier, and I wrote this down. You can't, you personally said, I can't change anybody, right? So that being said, as leaders, we're also encouraged to influence, right? We want to help people grow. And
Yes.
so we had a lot of questions about what do you do around creating a more inclusive environment, fostering that within people? And I think you answered that question in a lot of ways because you talked about modeling it. First of all, starting with yourself, you gave advice on how to bring up maybe what might be a difficult conversation in a way that people could hear it and receive it a little bit better. And so I think you just spoke to so much that people want to hear. But I want to ask another question on this topic.
Mhm.
And I'll read it again exactly how it was written.
Okay.
How do you make people feel included and comfortable when they've had negative experiences? So maybe they haven't felt included, especially when they feel no one wants to hear what they have to say. But when they're comfortable with individuals, they start to share great ideas and initiatives. So this is maybe more for some of those underrepresented folks who just feel like every time I walk into a room, no one cares what I think or what I have to say. They've been burned so many times for one reason or another. How would you encourage that population to kind of say, no, we value you and get them engaged?
So why don't I answer from two perspectives? Why don't I answer it from being an employee that's a part of that group that's feeling that way? And
Hmm.
then why don't I approach it from a leader that knows that this person may have that experience? Okay. I've
That's
been on
perfect.
both sides, so I can genuinely share with you how I dealt with it. But before I share with you how I dealt with it, I want to say to everyone who is a part of that community that feels that way, I want to tell you that you matter.
Mm.
I want you to know that even though we're virtual right now, I want you to know I see you and I feel you, and I know what it's like to feel invisible and like you don't matter. Now, knowing that you have value, and I've put that on social recently, everyone has value.
Mm.
Everyone has value. And it's the leader's responsibility to understand what each person's unique value proposition is so they can take advantage of it in their organization. But the way that I've handled it in the past, when I just felt like that I was dismissed or they didn't really care, is I actually had to find my courage and I had to confront the leader during a one on one conversation. And this is how that conversation went. We had our normal meeting, and I said, as we're working towards the end of the meeting, could we leave about 10 minutes? I'd like to share with you some experiences I've had because I think it's important we put it on the table because I want to use it as an opportunity to learn, but I also want to also provide that feedback so we can change the environment. And I basically said, I've noticed in this meeting, in this experience, at this event, and I had
Mm.
specific examples. I felt like no one ever wanted to hear what I had to say, cut off in the middle of my sentence,
Mm.
felt ignored. Whatever your feeling is, you tell them what you were feeling and says, it left me feeling like that you did not see value in me.
Mm.
And that bothers me because I work really hard to make sure that I can make a difference. And I want to
Mm.
know what could I have done differently to create a different experience. And in that moment, usually what happens, you assume positive intent always, okay? If they are coming from a good place, they immediately sit back and go, oh, I did not even realize it was happening.
Mm.
But you've got to have the courage to be able to share what your experience is and do it in a non threatening way. And just genuinely ask the question I just want to know how I could have done it different to get a different outcome. And what you will
Right.
find is they'll take some accountability. Most of the time, they're going to have to take all the accountability. Especially once you have the evidence of it and you've provided examples. I would
Sure.
encourage you to deal with it very close to the event because people have short memories. They will forget. So if you can deal with it as close as possible to the event. Now, as a leader, I've been in that situation where I knew someone felt marginalized, and it wasn't necessarily at my hand, but it was at the hand of others on the team. And
Hmm.
so I've come into meetings and said, I first want to acknowledge that I recognize that there are times you don't feel valued and you don't feel like your voice matters and you don't feel like we see you. And I want you to know we do. And I want to understand what your experiences have been. And I want you to know I'm committed to working to turn that around. And
Mm,
I have just found when there's acknowledgement for what people are feeling, you create space for them to share their real experiences and genuinely listen and resist the urge to do all the questioning while they're getting it out, because it takes a ton of courage to get
mm,
people to share deeply how they're feeling. And guess what? It takes a little bit longer because what they're doing is they're sampling how you're going to handle the first layer. And then if they see you're taking that first layer well, then they'll go deeper. And then if
yeah,
you just hang on long enough, they're going to really get to the crux of the issue. And that
right.
is where you can really begin to get your arms around what the issues are and start dealing with it. So I hope
Mm.
between the two, it helps someone.
Was such a great approach because I think you spoke to the heart of everyone on this call, at whatever place they find themselves on those conversations. And the other thing that I'm noticing about this discussion, as we're soon to move to a place where people can ask some additional questions, the advice that you've given has been so holistic. So when you approach this from the standpoint of, here is what, when I'm the offended person, how I approach it, I thought back to one of your earlier points where you talked about the importance of self-awareness. It takes a very self-aware person to go into that conversation. Not everyone is there just yet. And you shouldn't feel bad if you're on this call and like, I could never have that. That's okay. That's okay. Go back to some of the earlier steps that Lani shared and begin to build that base, because that'll get you there. And if you have already that strong self-awareness, then you're kind of ready to do that. And as you shared your answer from that standpoint, I thought of something. I can't remember where I got this, but it was 3 bits of advice when feeling you should speak up. And we all have had those moments like, should I say something? Should I not say something? And the advice was, first of all, do you mean it? Secondly, can you defend it? And third, can you say it in love? And when
Mm.
you just unpacked all of those things, it was, you came in with evidence. This is first, is really how you feel. I've got evidence to support it, but you said it in such a way to say, how could I have handled it different? It takes a very loving, self-aware person to be able to be there, but it works, right? You've seen people turn around and leadership change. But then as a person in leadership, to come in and say, hey, I see you, and
I
I'm going
see you.
to work with you to get it to change. To then recognize it's not, they're not going to respond right away. It's a layer by layer by
You
layer,
have
and
to let them do that
consistently.
clumsy conversation.
Yeah.
It's clumsy. And for those that are trying to prepare, build up the courage to have a conversation, strategies I've used, even for leaders who know they're about to go into a difficult conversation, you can do this. Write it down. Write down what
Mm,
you want to say and make, if you're
yeah.
angry, get that anger out on a piece of paper. And that's the one when you don't share, and then you clean it up. And sometimes you need someone to help you get beyond your anger. And I have an
Yeah.
executive coach, and strategy she uses with me is stand up. What is it? Okay, talk to me about how you feel. Now stand up and put yourself in the other person's shoes. And she will physically make me
Mm.
stand up and move on the other side of my chair. And she'll say,
I
now,
love
what is it
that.
like to be them? What are they possibly thinking? And then it
Right.
helps you just develop perspective and separate fact from emotion.
Mm, mm, Nuggets of gold. Capture it, folks. It's right here. Pro tips left and right coming at you. um, I love any of the attendees. We still have quite a few people with us today. We're winding down our hour. Please, if you have additional questions or clarifications on anything that's been stated so far, or something that you're curious about, please submit those questions now. I'm keeping an eye on the chat, but I would love to invite you, Lani, to, and I don't know what your perspective is on this, what conversations you have, but this question came in specifically asking what Microsoft is doing as it relates to the disparaging attacks in the Asian American Pacific Islander communities that we've been made aware of, not just recently, most recently, of course, with the shootings in Atlanta, but it's been going on for longer than that. So is there anything that you're aware of that would be insightful?
Yeah, but before I tell you about Microsoft, let me just say to everyone who has someone who's been impacted in this community, and I have a number of friends in this community, and colleagues, I stand with you. And
Mm,
I want you to know you're not alone and we're in it with you. And I don't support hate of any kind. And so it's important for me to say that because as an ally of this community, it's important they know that I stand with them. Microsoft has done a few things. First thing that they did is reach out to the community itself to make sure that those employees were safe and they understood what Microsoft's position was.
mm,
We do have an employee resource group for Asian American Pacific Islanders, and I'm really grateful that they have that community. And we also have a group of experts that really allow their stories to be heard so that we all are educated about what's happening in the community and what does support look like for them. Because
mm,
everyone has a different lived experience, and we have to acknowledge that. Everything happening in the world right now, everyone from their position has a different experience, and everyone may need something different. So we also took to social to make sure that everyone broadly understood Microsoft's position. And then we also aggregated a number of resources to be able to support the community, to make sure they were getting either the mental health support they needed or resources they needed to protect their families. So it's a
mm.
combination of things that we've done. So it was education. We wanted to make sure that we amplified the message of, anti-hate and make sure that they had all the resources that they needed.
Mm. Thank you both for your description of what's been taking place, the support that's being provided, but I think equally and maybe most importantly, your comment that we stand with you. And I
Stand
can
with them.
say
Absolutely.
the
We
same
have
thing.
to. We
Hmm.
have to stand with them. And we have to continue to stand together. I mean, we're all committed to creating a better world. And, we have seen some unfortunate situations happening all over. And
Hmm.
it just breaks my heart. But I think it's so important that we just continue to be there for one another. And personally, what I try to do is friends, you just contact them and just show up for them and say, hey, I know what's going on. And I just checking in on you and your family. Hope that you have peace soon and know that I stand with you and ask them what does support look like. That's all you can do right now.
Thank you very much. All right, I did receive a question here in the both the Q&A box and the chat box. I'd mentioned the chat earlier. I forgot entirely that we even have a separate Q&A box. So for those of you that are still with us, feel free to access that. I'm going to read it live. I'm not even sure what this question is, so both you and I will learn as we go. But the question is, I work in an office culture where people truly care about each other and are invested in each other as a community, which is a strength. But like most strengths, sometimes it gets in our way, as I feel it prevents us from having courageous conversations at times due to people being afraid to hurt feelings. As a leader, how can I help to foster more courageous conversation?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. Something that I've recently gone through is Brene Brown's Dare to Lead training. And one of the things that she introduced to us is this whole concept of a rumble. And the rumble means that you take some of the more difficult topics and you call it a rumble, which means we're going to have a difficult conversation, but maybe set some
Mm,
ground rules around that difficult conversation to make sure that people don't take it personal and that we want to make sure that we're confronting the hard truth about it and recognizing there's no penalty for that and there's no judgment for that. And what we're committed to is getting on the other side of the problem. And I think that as a leader, I would encourage you to just call it a rumble because it means, hopefully, what it means is we're going to have a tough conversation, but a healthy conversation. And if you want to know more about the details of it in the Brene Brown Dare to Lead book, she has a workbook available online as well. You'll hear her give you some tools around how to get people to drop the armor that come in all armored up and not willing to share, and how to begin to unpack that. But I would encourage you to have a rumble, to challenge the team to be able to have that difficult conversation, and you demonstrate that you're willing to have that difficult conversation without the judgment, but really focus on the learning and figuring out how to make things better.
hmm.
Does
Good,
that
great
help?
advice.
Yeah, I hope it
Yeah,
helps.
I think, and I love the fact that you're giving resources in your answer. It's interesting to me as someone who has traveled around a fair amount, but I grew up in the Midwest. I live here in Minnesota now, and there's this common phrase, Minnesota nice, right?
Oh,
Certain
yeah.
cultures, certain pockets of the country might be very unfamiliar with what it means to mix it up and rumble. Other parts of the country, that's how you say good morning in an aggressive manner, you know. So I think both from a generational standpoint, because the same is true of different generational perspectives. Some generations are more inclined to, you know, let's just talk bluntly. Others might be a little bit more reserved, and so it's great advice. And as a leader, understanding the culture you're in and the community that you're connecting with. Is the nuance, is the art of finessing that conversation. But I appreciate that. One of our first community conversations, the advice was, when we have these courageous discussions, you need to set the tone right out of the gate that this is a no offense zone, that people can be allowed to speak. And like you said, no judgment, no penalties. But you know, he said, leave your right to feel offended at the door, because that's not, you know, we're here to get issues out. Let's get on. We're getting more questions. I want to get in here. Here's a next one. It says, I'm on a DEI committee and our board of directors are mostly white. I am recommending that the board receive some training. A couple of training topics are white fragility, implicit bias, for instance. Anything that we recommend that these folks engage in. I'll just make one recommendation. They should bring BridgeWorks in, because we're doing a lot of DE&I training, wink, wink. But Lani, what advice?
I think that's all they need to hear. I would, I do recommend, you can do some of the, I think anytime you can do any bias training, everyone needs to understand the unconscious and conscious biases, because it's very illuminating, because I think people all start to identify themselves. I also think you should do custom training, because every organization is different. And then if you have someone that understands the unique challenges to your company, and that's where BridgeWorks can come in and help you, I think it would be super helpful. I think one of the most valuable things that we experienced at Microsoft is, as we were going through our unconscious bias training, they actually use actors to create experiences on a stage. Actually, I was in person for this, but you could do it virtually. And you watch them interact, and all the scenarios were based on similar work situations that we're in every day. And then you saw it played out, and you could not help but have it tap into a level of empathy and compassion for the employees, because you saw it play out. So get as creative as you need to around that. But I do think custom training helps, because every environment is so different. So I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question, and then I want to give you a chance to say anything that your heart leads you to as we wrap up our discussion, because you brought so much wisdom, but maybe there's one last nugget left inside that you'd send this team off with. But the question is, how do you ground yourself when emotions happen? So speaking back to that rumble, honesty comes out, all of a sudden tension begins to fill you or the room. How do you guide a team member through it and ensure you're keeping yourself in check? Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'm a firm believer in just own your mistakes and just say, you know, I'm not proud of how I showed up. I was in my feelings. I had a lot of emotion in this situation. Let me take a step back. I've tried that. I try really hard to keep my emotions under control, and sometimes it just doesn't happen. And when I see someone's emotions raising, I'll try to find a way to decompress the situation, to give them room to be able to step back a little bit. Or sometimes you just have to sit there and listen, unless they're just totally releasing themselves on somebody, where you're just kind of going after another individual, yelling at them, screaming at them. I would intervene immediately and interrupt that one. But I would just say, if it's you, just own it and just say, I'm not proud of how I showed up. And then if you see someone doing it, sometimes you can find little phrases to stop them and to try to catch them. And virtually it's tough. Because
Mm,
if they're not looking at their chat, how do you
right.
stop them? You can put them on mute.
Yeah.
You can put them on mute. That's one way to do it. Just
Yeah.
so that you can save the employee. Or you can, somebody did this, they kicked them out of a meeting.
Mm.
So, I mean, you got to get creative virtually. But hopefully,
Yes.
I think the most important thing is to one, you need to have a conversation with that individual and give them an opportunity to one, say what they need to say, but also give them feedback because sometimes it's not what we say, it's how we say it.
Mm. So
And we
true.
have to be
So
mindful
true.
of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
60 seconds. Any last thought that you want to leave with the team? We have unanswered questions. I apologize to everyone that we couldn't get to every question with this time. We'll do our best to answer these in some type of a written format and share them out with the group. Maybe add that to the link. This is being recorded. It will be shared. Please pass it along. We hope you found value. But Lani, what would you like to send our guests off with today?
Well, I mean, I think I would just leave it with we're all a work in progress. And
Mm,
I can't stress enough that right now during this time, be good to yourselves and
mm,
take the time you need to give yourself that self care and take care of your mind, body, and spirit so that
mm.
you don't get too burned out. I also
Yes.
think it's important that you remember that everyone is going through this together and everyone
Mm,
has a unique experience. And I cannot stress to you the importance of meeting people where they are at. Check
mm.
in, just check in because everyone is having a different experience. And then when you check in with them and you see they need help, ask them what support looks like for them. Don't try to solve it. Ask them what do they need. And sometimes people need time and space to figure that out. And then when they tell you, follow through on trying to
Mm.
get them the support and the help that they need. But I just want to say to everyone, I'm looking forward to us getting on the other side. But I am grateful that we've had this experience because I'm hoping that we're all better for it in the end.
Mm.
And I'm just so grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you, Phil, and to everyone out there.
So well said. And I needed to hear everything you just shared. So thank you.
Oh, you're
To
welcome.
all of you that have attended, we will have another community conversation next month. I don't know that we'll ever have one quite as great as this, but Lani, it has been a true pleasure. And thank you for joining and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great day.
God, every minute. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Phil.
Bye.